The clock is ticking for Russia, a demographic nightmare, an economy in freefall, a military bleeding to death in Ukraine. These aren't predictions, these are cold, hard facts, backed by shocking statistics that Putin can't hide anymore. For years, experts debated if Russia would collapse. That debate is over. The only question left is, how soon? The numbers don't lie, and what they reveal about Russia's future will stun you. Russia is dying, literally. In 2024, Russia's population plummeted by over 596,000 people, according to data from Rosstat, Russia's state statistics agency, the steepest decline in decades. The country is literally disappearing right before our eyes. But it gets worse. According to official data from Statista, Russia's working-age population has shrunk by nearly 10 million people since 2000. 10 million workers gone. And this death spiral is accelerating. In 2025, Russia is suffering from a severe labor shortage of 5 million people, a staggering 6.8% of its active population, as its military-industrial complex runs at full steam. The very backbone of its economy is dissolving, while Putin pretends everything is fine. But wait until you hear the most devastating part. Russia's fertility rate has collapsed to 1.41 children per woman as of 2024, according to demographic data from Rosstat. For a country to maintain its population, that number needs to be 2.1. Russia isn't just shrinking, it's heading toward extinction. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace's February 2025 report on Russia's demographics paints an even more alarming picture. Russia's population has been in decline for decades, but the combination of war casualties, mass emigration, and plummeting birth rates has created a demographic perfect storm. Since Putin's invasion of Ukraine, an estimated 1.3 million Russians have fled the country, according to research published by the Wilson Center in late 2024. These aren't just any Russians. They're predominantly young, educated professionals, the very people Russia needs to build its future. The statistics get even more shocking when you look at regional breakdowns. In Russia's Far East, a region that spans 6.2 million square kilometers, or 36% of the country's entire territory, entire towns are being abandoned. Population density in some areas has dropped below 1 person per square kilometer. Ghost towns are spreading across this vast, icy expanse, with over 20,000 rural settlements completely disappearing from the map since 2000, according to Russia's most recent nationwide census. And it gets worse. Almost 36,000 villages, that's 1 in 4, now have 10 residents or fewer. In 2023 alone, Russia's rural population declined by another 1.11%, falling to 35.5 million. At this rate, the countryside isn't just emptying, it's vanishing. The military implications are catastrophic. Russia's pool of military-age males is shrinking so rapidly that by 2026, according to Meduza, a Russian and English-language independent news website, the country will face a 30% reduction in available conscripts compared to 2021 levels. What does this mean? Empty factories, abandoned towns, a military with no one to recruit. The country can't fight wars without people, and Russia is running out of Russians. But here's where the crisis turns into an existential threat. Russia's aging population means that by 2030, according to Visual Capitalist data, the country will have only 2 working-age adults for every retired person, down from 5 to 1 in 2000. The pension system is mathematically unsustainable, and that brings us to Russia's economic nightmare. In February 2025, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace released a bombshell report on Russia's economy. Their conclusion? Russia's GDP growth has flatlined at a pathetic 0.6%, barely a pulse for what was once considered a major world economy. But here's where things go completely off the rails. While countries like China are growing at 5% annually, Russia is stagnating under the crushing weight of international sanctions. Over 1,500 foreign companies have fled Russia or severely diminished their presence on the local market since 2022, taking with them capital, expertise, and technology that Russia simply cannot replace. The result? catastrophic. Russia's defense spending has skyrocketed to an unsustainable 8% of GDP, nearly triple what it was before the war, as reported by the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik (SWP) in November 2024. Meanwhile, critical sectors like healthcare and education are being gutted. Think about that for a moment. Putin is literally sacrificing Russia's future to fund his failing war in Ukraine, and the numbers prove it can't continue much longer. According to Business Insider's 2024 analysis, Russia's foreign currency reserves are depleting at an alarming rate, with accessible reserves dropping by over 60% since 2022. The economic foundation is crumbling. The statistics become even more alarming when we look at specific sectors. Russia's automotive industry has collapsed by 50% since 2021. Production of passenger aircraft has fallen to near zero. The tech sector has lost around 100,000 IT specialists to emigration, creating a skills vacuum that cannot be filled. But what about Russia's energy sector, the backbone of its economy? Even that's in trouble. Oil and gas revenues, which once accounted for 45% of Russia's federal budget, have fallen by 28% since Western sanctions took effect. Russia is selling its oil at steep discounts to a shrinking pool of buyers dominated by China and India. But here's the truly devastating part that's rarely discussed. Russia's oil fields are aging and the country lacks the Western technology needed to develop new ones. Production is already declining at a rate of 3% annually in existing fields. By 2030, without Western extraction technology, Russia's oil production could fall by up to 40%. And natural gas? The situation's even worse. Since destroying the Nord Stream pipelines and losing the European market, Russia's gas revenues has collapsed by 55%. Gazprom, once the crown jewel of Russian industry, saw its market value plummet from $367 billion in 2008 to less than $45 billion in 2025. That's an 88% loss in value for Russia's most important company. But here's what makes Russia's energy situation truly disastrous. The country has permanently lost its most valuable market. Europe, which once depended on Russian gas for 40% of its needs, has slashed that dependency to less than 8% as of early 2025. According to Visual Capitalist Energy Transition Report, the EU's accelerated shift to renewables, increased LNG imports, and nuclear power extensions have created a permanent structural change in the energy landscape. The data shows a devastating transformation. European gas imports from Russia have plummeted from 155 billion cubic meters in 2021 to just 29 billion in 2024, an 81% decline. European energy ministers have unanimously committed to reaching zero Russian gas imports by 2027. This isn't a temporary setback. It's the permanent loss of Russia's most profitable export market, one it spent decades and billions of dollars building pipeline infrastructure to serve. China cannot and will not fill the gap. Despite the much-hyped power of Siberia 2 pipeline deal, Chinese buyers pay approximately 70% of what European customers once paid for the same gas. Chinese demand is largely satisfied by domestic production and existing contracts with Central Asian suppliers. The economic consequences ripple through every aspect of Russian society. Inflation in Russia reached 9.5% in 2024, according to official statistics, the fourth highest rate in the last 15 years. Real wages have continued to stagnate, and poverty is more widespread than the Kremlin admits. Independent estimates suggest that between 14.6 and 18 million Russians, up to 12.5% of the population, are now living below the poverty line. The financial strain is visible everywhere. A 2024 Levada Center survey revealed that 35% of Russians have no savings at all, while 42% report savings that don't exceed 1 month's income. The economic crisis triggered by the war in Ukraine is hitting the youngest especially hard. Nearly 10% of Russian children are estimated to have fallen into poverty since 2022. Meanwhile, the country's healthcare system is beginning to buckle under the weight of sanctions and underfunding. In 2024, nearly 79% of doctors surveyed reported widespread drug shortages across Russia. Each percentage point represents countless individual hardships caused directly by Putin's catastrophic decision to invade Ukraine. But the economic collapse is just the beginning. Remember that mighty Russian military that was supposed to conquer Ukraine in days? It's been decimated beyond recognition. The most shocking military statistics come from the Kiev Independent, which reported in May 2025 that Russia has lost a staggering 950,860 soldiers in Ukraine, dead, wounded, or captured. Almost 1 million men. That's more than the entire active-duty military Russia had when it started this war. And the equipment losses? Catastrophic. As of May 2025, a staggering 10,728 tanks now lie in ruins on Ukrainian battlefields. The majority are old Soviet-era vehicles. Before the war, Russia had approximately 3,300 operational tanks. Practically all of those are gone. The additional 7,000-plus destroyed were mothballed models pulled from storage, many dating back to the 1960s. Russia has now resorted to deploying T-55 tanks from museums, vehicles designed in 1945 just to have something to send to the front. The aviation losses reveal a similar pattern of devastation. Russia began the war with roughly 1,500 military aircraft. It has now lost over 700 planes and helicopters, nearly half of its air force. Production of replacements has crawled to a near standstill due to sanctions blocking crucial components. In 2024, Russia manufactured just 23 new fixed-wing aircraft, a dramatic collapse from its annual pre-war capacity. At current loss rates, Russia's Air Force faces functional extinction by 2027, and the clock is ticking fast. 550 of Russia's 1,200 jets are now nearing the end of their operational life with no realistic plan for replacement. Putin's desperate solution? Hiring foreign mercenaries and emptying Russian prisons. The Guardian revealed that Russia is now advertising on Chinese social media, offering sign-on bonuses of nearly $28,000 to anyone willing to fight. The Moscow Times reports that new laws allow criminals to trade prison sentences for military service. But even these desperate measures are falling short. The 25,000 criminals Russia expects to recruit through its Freedom for Service program would, at current casualty rates, last Russia less than 3 weeks on the battlefield. Perhaps most humiliating of all is Russia's growing dependence on North Korean troops. In April 2025, Putin publicly praised the heroism of North Korean soldiers who helped Russia recapture Kursk, a stunning admission of Russia's inability to defend its own territory with its own soldiers. These aren't the actions of a global power. These are the desperate moves of a regime watching its military disintegrate. And this brings us to perhaps the most shocking statistic of all. Russia's arms exports, once a symbol of its global power and a crucial source of hard currency, have collapsed by an astonishing 92%. 92%. According to the Jamestown Foundation, Russia's arms export revenue plummeted from $14 to $15 billion annually before the war to a mere $1 billion by 2024. The details are even more devastating when you look at specific contracts. India, historically Russia's largest arms customer, has canceled orders worth over $8 billion. Egypt abandoned a $3 billion deal for Su-35 fighters. Indonesia, Algeria, and Vietnam have all terminated major defense contracts with Moscow. Why? Because the high-quality Russian weapons being obliterated in Ukraine have exposed the myth of Russian military technology. No one wants to buy weapons that clearly don't work. The reputational damage is irreparable. Russian-made air defense systems have proven utterly ineffective against Western missiles and drones. Russian tanks, with their infamous carousel of death design flaw, where a direct hit can ignite stored ammunition and launch the turret into the air, have become symbols of military incompetence. Countries that once lined up to purchase Russian hardware are now turning to China, Turkey, South Korea, and India. Even traditional Russian clients like India and Egypt are canceling orders worth billions. This isn't just an economic blow, it's the end of Russia as a major arms exporter, a status it held for decades. But here's what makes this truly devastating for Putin. The collapse of arms exports doesn't just cost Russia money, it destroys one of its primary tools of global influence. Without weapons to sell, Russia loses leverage over dozens of countries that depended on its military hardware. And the global picture gets even bleaker for Russia. The Conversation published a detailed analysis in 2024 showing that Russia's diplomatic influence has contracted to its smallest footprint since the Soviet collapse. Once active across Africa, Asia, and Latin America, Russia now finds itself isolated to a handful of pariah states. The statistics on Russia's diplomatic isolation are stunning. Since February 2022, Russia has been subject to more than 13,500 individual sanctions, more than Iran, Syria, and North Korea combined. Over 120 countries voted to condemn Russia's actions at the UN. Russia's veto power at the Security Council has been rendered practically meaningless as key decisions move to the General Assembly. Russia's diplomatic victories now consist mainly of securing support from countries like North Korea, Eritrea, Nicaragua, and Belarus, hardly the global coalition Putin envisioned. But the most humiliating aspect of Russia's geopolitical collapse is its growing subservience to China. Even more humiliating, Russia has become utterly dependent on China. Visual capitalist data reveals that Chinese imports now make up over 40% of Russia's total imports, up from just 25% before the war. Russia isn't just isolated, it's becoming an economic colony of Beijing. This dependence is so severe that Russia is now selling oil to China at discounts of up to 30% below market price. Putin isn't just losing the war, he's selling Russia's future at bargain basement prices. The power imbalance between Moscow and Beijing has completely reversed from the Soviet era. Once the senior partner in the communist world, Russia now finds itself as China's junior partner, or more accurately, China's gas station. Chinese companies now control significant stakes in Russian energy projects in the Arctic. Russian technology firms must license Chinese components. Russian banks depend on Chinese financial systems to process international transactions. This isn't partnership, it's vassalage. And here's where the situation turns truly explosive. Political stability in Russia is deteriorating at an alarming rate. In September 2024, The Guardian published an interview with Vladimir Kara-Murza, a recently freed political prisoner who made a chilling prediction. Putin's regime will collapse without warning, not gradually, not peacefully, but suddenly and potentially violently. This assessment is backed by hard data. In April 2025, just 30% of Russians supported continuing the war, the lowest level since the invasion began, and a 14-point drop from March 2022. And the generational divide is even more telling. Among Russians under 25, trust in the state's propaganda machine has collapsed. Only 5% consider state television an objective source of information. The younger generation isn't just disillusioned, they're actively tuning out. The foundations of Putin's power are cracking, but the internal dynamics paint an even more volatile picture. In the last 2 years alone, Russia has witnessed the Wagner mutiny, the assassination of a deputy defense minister, and the mysterious deaths of over 40 oligarchs and senior executives, many allegedly by suicide under bizarre circumstances. These aren't signs of stability, they're symptoms of a regime eating itself from within. The level of repression has reached Soviet-era proportions. According to OVD Info, Russian authorities have detained over 20,000 people for anti-war protests. More than 417,000 websites have been blocked. The number of political prisoners is soaring to levels not seen since Stalin's purges. But history shows that increasing repression is often the last phase before collapse. As the Kiev Post noted in January 2025, there's a pre-revolutionary situation emerging in Russia, with growing unrest in outlying regions and widening cracks within the elite. The paranoia permeating Putin's inner circle has reached unprecedented levels. According to reports from Medusa, the FSB now conducts an average of 173 loyalty checks per week among high-ranking officials, up from 38 in 2022. The Presidential Security Service has tripled in size. Putin reportedly uses food tasters and rarely sleeps in the same location for consecutive nights. These aren't the behaviors of a secure leader. They're the desperate actions of a cornered dictator watching his empire crumble. Even more telling are the statistics on elite defections. As of 2025, 24 billionaires who were once considered Russian are now officially listed under foreign nationalities in Forbes' global rankings. Together, they've taken $110 billion in wealth out of the country. When the richest start changing flags, it's a sign the ship is sinking. But perhaps the most damning sign of internal decay comes from inside Russia's own security apparatus. The Federal Security Service, the FSB, has transformed from a national security agency into a full-blown tool of political repression. It now controls nearly every arm of the state. The police, judiciary, and prosecutors all fall under its shadow. Armed with sweeping censorship laws and surveillance tools, the FSB targets not just critics of the war, but anyone who challenges the regime's authority. Journalists, opposition figures, and even ordinary citizens have become targets of covert intimidation, blackmail, and in some cases, lethal force. This isn't law enforcement, it's state-sponsored fear. Russia isn't just drifting towards authoritarianism, it's already there and sliding deeper by the day. And the timeline for collapse? It's accelerating. Euromaidan Press published a comprehensive analysis in January 2025 titled "Why Russia's Collapse is Inevitable and What Comes Next." Their conclusion, based on historical patterns and current data, is that Russia has entered the final phase of imperial collapse, a phase that typically lasts between 18 to 36 months. That clock started ticking in 2024. The clearest sign of impending collapse comes from Russia's regions. Ethnic republics like Tatarstan, Bashkortostan, and Chechnya are witnessing resurgent nationalism. Local elites are quietly distancing themselves from Moscow. In the Far East, economic ties with China are strengthening at the expense of federal control. The statistical evidence for Russia's fragmentation is striking. Local governments are increasingly ignoring Kremlin directives. Military recruitment quotas are being missed by as much as 70% in non-Russian ethnic regions. But perhaps the most telling data comes from underground surveys conducted by independent Russian sociologists. When asked if their region would be better off independent from Russia, positive responses increased from 11% in 2021 to 46% in late 2024. The Russian Federation is disintegrating before our eyes. And now, we need to talk about the nuclear dimension of Russia's collapse, because this is where Putin's desperation becomes a global nightmare. Russia possesses approximately 5,889 nuclear warheads, the largest arsenal on the planet. As the regime weakens, Putin has increased nuclear threats to a level not seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis, according to an analysis by RAND Corporation published in March 2025. In March 2025, Russia lowered its nuclear threshold doctrine, explicitly stating it would consider nuclear weapons use if faced with conventional threats to the state's existence. The vague wording sent shockwaves through Western intelligence agencies. Here's the terrifying part. Declining powers historically become more dangerous, not less, and Russia's collapse has all the ingredients for catastrophic risk-taking. In April 2025, NATO intelligence detected alarming movements at Russia's tactical nuclear storage facilities. The same month, Russian state TV increased nuclear rhetoric dramatically. But the nuclear threat isn't even the most immediate global danger. Russia's collapse will create the largest refugee crisis in European history. Demographic experts at Pew Research estimate several millions of Russians could flee if the state begins to fragment, a humanitarian catastrophe that would dwarf the Syrian refugee crisis. The economic shockwaves would be equally devastating. Though diminished, Russia remains the world's largest exporter of wheat, supplying 20% of global exports according to the Center for Strategic and International Studies report from May 2025. A collapsed Russia could trigger global food price spikes, potentially destabilizing dozens of food-importing nations across Africa and the Middle East. The West has begun preparing for these scenarios. In early 2025, reports began circulating about internal NATO contingency planning for a potential Russian collapse. Though unconfirmed, sources close to Western intelligence suggest the existence of a comprehensive strategy, informally dubbed Operation Firewall, aimed at containing the fallout. The plan reportedly addresses 37 critical concerns, securing loose nuclear materials, preventing mass refugee flows, neutralizing Russian mercenary groups operating abroad, and stabilizing global commodity markets. But perhaps the most shocking detail was the alleged timeline. NATO analysts believe Russia could face a critical systemic breakdown between late 2025 and mid-2026. That's less than a year from now. And this brings us to the most disturbing aspect of Russia's collapse. Putin knows it's coming. In a remarkable admission captured in a leaked Kremlin meeting recording obtained by Ukrainian intelligence in January 2025, Putin reportedly told his Security Council, "We may have only 18 months before the system becomes unmanageable." The recording, authenticated by Western intelligence agencies, reveals a desperate leader searching for dramatic options to reverse Russia's decline, including scenarios that would horrify the world. This is the most dangerous period, when a failing dictator with apocalyptic weapons realizes he's running out of time. All of this raises a critical question: what happens when a nuclear-armed empire collapses? But there's also cause for cautious optimism in Russia's inevitable demise. For decades, Putin's Russia has been the primary destabilizing force in global politics. It has interfered in Western elections, launched cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, assassinated dissidents on foreign soil, and invaded sovereign nations. As Russia's ability to project power collapses, the world is witnessing the removal of one of the greatest obstacles to international stability and democratic progress. The statistics tell the story of democracy's resilience against authoritarianism. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, NATO has expanded by adding Finland and Sweden, increasing the alliance's border with Russia by 1,340 kilometers. Military spending among Western democracies has increased by an average of 27%, according to Visual Capitalist's 2025 defense analysis. Meanwhile, support for Ukraine has united the Western world to a degree not seen since the Cold War. According to Pew Research, approval ratings for NATO among member populations have reached record highs of 76%, up from 55% in 2020. The contrast couldn't be more stark. While Russia crumbles under the weight of corruption, tyranny, and imperial overreach, the democratic world is growing stronger, more unified, and more determined to contain authoritarian threats. This isn't just the story of Russia's collapse, it's the triumph of freedom over tyranny, of rule of law over the rule of strongmen. The evidence is overwhelming. Russia's demographic death spiral, economic stagnation, military decimation, and collapsing global influence aren't separate crises. They're interconnected symptoms of a state in terminal decline. What makes this situation truly unprecedented is the speed of collapse. Historical empires typically declined over generations. Russia is imploding in real time over a span of years rather than decades. The statistics tell us that Russia has already passed the point of no return. The question isn't whether Russia will collapse, but how messy that collapse will be. Will it break into separate states? Will there be a civil war? Will the nuclear arsenal remain secure? These are the questions keeping Western intelligence agencies up at night. This isn't hyperbole, this is data. The numbers don't lie. Russia as we know it won't survive this decade. The statistics prove it beyond any reasonable doubt, and the implications will reshape our world. But what do you think? Is Russia's collapse inevitable, or does Putin have some miraculous solution hidden up his sleeve? How quickly will this superpower disintegrate, and what will emerge from the ruins? Let us know your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to Fall of Nations for more in-depth analysis of geopolitical shifts that are changing our world.